Everyone, and welcome.
Hold on.
Now?
His computer not working? Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We are so happy that you have chosen to spend some time with us as we talk about two extremely important and significant topics today. We're going to talk about the neuropsychology of violence, and we are pleased to have with us again Dr. Jehudi Bayul. And we're going to talk about the implications of the Supreme Court decision regarding Roe versus Wade. And that conversation will be led by attorney Alicia Rochelle. And with that, I'll turn it over to our founder, Dr. Randall Maxey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neighbor Stevens, and welcome to Dr. Ivan Walks and our other attendees so much. We're 1 week after Juneteenth, and we understand that over the past 2 months, we've had a lot of violence in our communities, some of it being racially motivated, some of it being based upon not only race, but some issues of mental health, we believe, and some on the ever-present threat of AR-15 guns in our society. We also have seen out of control politicians. And we heard this week that we know that the former president's White House was interested in having the pandemic play itself out by using levels of infection that resulted in many unnecessary deaths, trying to attain what they call herd immunity. So we know that some of the deaths in our community were purposeful to get the so-called herd immunity, if that even exists. And then lastly, we know that the branch of government that has been entrusted with providing interpretation of the US Constitution has taken an extreme turn to the right. And I do believe that at least one justice is a strict constructionist and is implicating that if it was not in the original Constitution, it's not constitutional or legal. What does that really mean? That means that there was no consideration for AR-15s because they didn't exist back then. We know that African slaves were counted as 3/4 of a man or 2/3 of a man. We know that we had no rights then. So not only is there now turning back at Roe versus Wade, but every right that you have is now potentially under consideration to be rolled back. And this does affect our mental, physical, and spiritual health. So we want to have a wide open discussion on these issues. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Jehudi Bayul, who is a licensed practicing psychologist in Miami, Florida. And I'm going to ask Dr. Walks to summarize his CV. And he's going to be followed by attorney Rochelle, who practices in the city of Washington, D.C. So with that, Dr. Walks, would you summarize Dr. Bayul's CV?
Happy to do that, Dr. Maxey. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. I see on the screen there, it's Dr. V. So I'm going to be familiar and say Dr. V. So let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. V, and we're very happy to have you with us. Trained in both school psychology and clinical neuropsychology, Dr. V is licensed and certified and maintains a private practice in pediatric school neuropsychology in Miami, Florida. He is a consultant school neuropsychologist and vendor to the Miami-Dade Public Schools, Office of Vocal Rehabilitation, Children's Medical Services, Office of Child Find. He is a lead analyst and applied behavioral analyst for children with severe neurobehavioral and developmental disorders. Dr. V is former diplomat in school neuropsychology from the American Board of School Neuropsychology. He is a member of the American Psychological Association Division 16 School Psychology and Division 40 Academy of Neuropsychology. He is a member of Florida Applied Behavioral Analyst Association, FABA, and the Florida Biofeedback Society. And let me just say that is the short version. There's a lot that we could say about Dr. V, and we're going to ask him to go ahead and tell us a little bit about all the amazing things that he has done and things we should know about.
Wow. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I truly appreciate it. First of all, thank you, Dr. Maxey, again for this wonderful invitation to, to present on this important topic. I have to give shout outs to Judy, who actually is she's the foundation of why all this is happening in the first place. And of course, Simon, a good friend and a beautiful young brother who continues that fight to be sure that our children are as healthy as they can be. So yes, I'll be talking about an important topic. And I think I would like to preface by saying that the issue between brain function and behavior is no longer an issue among neuroscientists. It tends to be more of an issue with lay people who tend to believe that behavior is independent of brain function. And that does not have scientific merit, where we know, for an example, that all behavior is a function of the brain. So we're going to be dealing today with an important topic. I presented this topic some years ago, and I'm happy to say that the information that will be provided today will be pretty much the latest cutting edge research that we know about the brain behavior relationship, specifically when it comes to acts of violence. School shootings are on the rise. Expect that to continue to happen, unfortunately. Expect it to continue to happen because the level of analysis of understanding the reason people become prone to violence are often given various interpretations. It could be environmental, it could be because of a poor family, it could be because the child is Black, the child is poor. And none of the information, unfortunately, there are a few discussions about the link between violence and brain function, and that's really unfortunate. So I'm happy to be here, truly. And again, I thank Dr. Maxey for this opportunity because it allows me to share with you, to raise questions in your communities, to begin discussions among yourselves about the issue that I'm going to be discussing, but also to talk about the area of prevention, to look at what we're doing as early as pre-K. And when I say pre-K, I'm talking about infant programs, because there are things that we know. There's so much research that gives us an ample amount of data that shows that even infants, if it's not caught earlier, then we find that these children are passed along, and subsequently these things begin to happen when it's too late, when things tragically happen. Again, we are focusing too much on psychological factors, and we're not focusing on neurological and neurodevelopmental factors. And with that being said, let me now share, and you guys should be able to see this presentation. If you can see it, please let me know. I'm going to begin this slideshow. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, see, okay. So we're dealing with the neuropsychology of violence, and we're going to take a look at this. Hopefully, I can get through all the slides. Some of them I may go somewhat quickly because I know I have another presenter, and I definitely don't want to overstep my bounds into her time. There was a conference in Colorado in 2001 it was a neurobehavioral conference in Aspen, Colorado in 2001 to deal with the issue of violence. And again, these were working groups from neurology, from psychiatry, neuropsychology, trauma surgery, nursing, evolutionary psychology, ethics, and law that pretty much came up with a consensus that aggression is more or less adaptive, but when it comes to violence, violence is an aggressive act that has an intention of harming or causing some type of physical injury to the victim. And from that conference, the conclusion was that violence can result from brain dysfunction. Although there are social and evolutionary factors that can contribute, but the foundation of violence tend to be more biological. Can it be enhanced through the social arena? Absolutely. Can we see these? Can we see it through an evolutionary realm? Absolutely. However, it seems to be the primary area tends to be that violence does result from brain dysfunction. And as a result of that, the latest research shows that when we take a look at the neurobehavioral aspects of violence, we find one particular area of the brain that I'll be talking about mostly today that have been implicated in acts of violence, and specifically the frontal cortex. We find that we find altered 5-HT metabolism, for an example, and particularly the role of influence of heredity will definitely lead to promising interventions for the future. So that being said, I can move into the presentation. As many people are not aware of what neuropsychology is, basically, neuropsychology is a study basically between brain function and behavior. And we do this because we understand that the brain is the primary organ for producing what psychologists call behavior. Neuroscientists tend to call it movement. And I'll explain what that means momentarily. Neuropsychology, basically, the assessments in neuropsychology are primarily non-invasive. And it provides us with a method of describing brain functionings on patients through either standardized tests that are very sensitive to brain behavior relationships. We can also use medical technology in the form of EEG neurofeedback to target areas of the brain that are dysfunctional when MRIs and EEGs are normal. And I want to say that again, you can have a normal MRI as you can have a normal EEG and still have brain dysfunction. So I will deal with this a little later if you have any questions on that. So anyway, neuropsychologists are typically found in hospitals, rehab centers. They're typically found in programs where patients have been traumatically injured. You would rarely find them in schools. Education in neuropsychology tend not to be pleasant partners, if you will. And it's really unfortunate because children with learning problems, whether we're talking dyslexia, which is a reading disorder, whether we're talking about dyscalculia or aphasia, these are all neurological problems, and educators have yet to embrace the science side of behavior. Okay, so neuropsychologists tend to work in departments of neurology, working with neurosurgeons and neurologists in a medical setting. And their primary role there is basically to do pre-testing with patients undergoing surgery, and post-op testing to determine whether or not there's been any changes in behavior function as a result of the surgery. Typically, for an example, you have patients with memory issues, sometimes that can be resolved depending upon where the tumor or the encephalopathy is in the brain. But basically, that's where you find neuropsychologists. Today, they tend to be more diverse. You find them in hospitals. We have centers, schools now, and we are able to do this, quite frankly, because of the advances in medical technology. So let me begin with emotion, since violence basically fundamentally comes from emotion. And so I want to just lay this foundation very quickly to see that there are many factors to emotion. And when people say things like, you ask a person, well, how do you feel? And the person said, I don't feel anything. Well, there's really no such thing as a neutral emotion. Basically, you're going to either feel it or you don't feel it. It's going to be a positive emotion or a negative. And these reactions are tied to specific situations and the person may encounter. We find, for an example, that there are physiological changes, of course, that will accompany behaviors, or at least there's going to be, in the patient, there's going to be some type of urge to perform those test behaviors. Not only that, but we also know that hormones play a significant role in emotions. The hormones are secreted by the adrenal medulla. And what these hormones do is that they increase blood flow to the muscles that allows the person to either, as you heard the expression, fight or flight. So the fight or flight reaction tends to be more hormonal. And we want this to happen to muscles because what they do is that they will now allow blood flow and important nutrients to be available to muscles when they're, and of course, converted to glucose, which will allow us to run away or fight our way out of the situation. Hormonal responses are, of course, reinforce the autonomic responses that I just mentioned, the fight or flight response. And these hormones are typically secreted in the brain, the adrenal medulla, which secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what this does, again, is allows increased blood flow to the muscles, which then are converted into glucose, which allow the person to fight it out or run away from the situation. There is the neuroanatomy of fear, and we talk a lot about psychological processes. And again, psychological processes are important. However, behavior has a biological foundation. It has a physiological basis. So we know, for an example, where in the brain the anatomy of fear resides. And you have the amygdala, the organ, which is the subcortical region of the brain. And here we're going to pay specific attention to the lateral nucleus and the central nucleus, which are two regions of the amygdala that tends to be responsible for fear responses. Now, you can be conditioned to fear. I mean, some things, when people develop phobias or if they develop phobic reactions to the things that they were never afraid of before, these can be psychologically conditioned. However, in order to be psychologically conditioned to fear or any type of emotional response, it has a biological basis. This is the region that we're talking about here. In this schematic diagram, you see we're looking at a mid-sagittal view of the brain, and we're just going to open it up and we're going to focus our attention to the amygdala. And I want you to pay specific attention to the regions of the amygdala that I just mentioned. And if you can see my arrow here, we're looking at, these are pathways that connects the midbrain, for an example, the hypothalamus, which feeds into the pons, which feeds into the central nucleus. And you see what these feed into. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex is what mediates emotional responses. So what that means that you can have damage here to the amygdala structure itself, or you can have damage here to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or you can have pathway damage. These are neurofibers that connect the subcortical regions to the cortical regions, and you can also have problems there as well. So you can, people with anxiety problems, people who are have difficulty regulating their anger, people have difficulty with rage responses will tend to have problems in this region of the brain that I'm pointing to. All right, so this I will pass over. I don't want to get into all this, but basically what this shows you is that these are in the blue areas that you're looking at. These are the different regions of the brain that subserve behavioral correlates. So we see, for an example, the lateral hypothalamus, and we see that it has both behavioral and physiological responses. Particularly, it is definitely responsible for sympathetic action, increased heart rate, blood pressure, paleness, and so on and so forth. And you can see that they have, so when I say the brain behavior relationship, this is a good schematic diagram that shows you that there are behavioral correlates to physiological responses in the brain. Okay, so as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you can condition a person to learn how to fear. You can condition a person to experience a fear of things or places or whatever. I mean, that can happen. These are called the conditioned emotional responses. We know now that conditioned emotional responses can be conditioned classically. Classically conditioned responses will occur, and I'm going to show you in a minute the schematic diagram, but basically I won't read all this to you, but we know that we can condition classically. And once again, whether it's classical conditioning or whether it's operant conditioning, both of these factors require physiological changes in the brain. I do want you to pay attention to the second bullet. The second bullet is where I'm going to be focusing much of my discussion this afternoon. That is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. It is this region of the cortex that we will pay attention to because this region of the brain has been implicated in acts of violence. All right, so here's a very classical, a simple diagram of a rat who's conditioned. We're conditioning him. So we'd start with the blue on the top schematic diagram. You see little, just call him little Albert. So here's little Albert. So he gets on the blue rug and we shock him. And then we shock him so much to the point now we take him out, we put him in another cage. In this particular cage, he sees the blue bottom. And what does he do immediately? He fears. Right away, he freezes. And that's what you can do. And that's what happens when you're in fear. You're either going to do two things. You're going to run away or you're just going to stop. You know, it's a physiological response. So notice what he does. So when he gets on the blue pad, we shock him repeatedly, so much so that now when he gets into a box with a blue pad, he freezes. In other words, he's anticipating that something will happen, and so nothing happens, but he still remains in fear. Now we put him in another box, and as you can see, the bottom of this box is purple. Now he engages in normal behavior. He will stand on his hind legs. He'll begin to sniff around. Now he presents with no fear. Now we're going to condition him. We're going to now put him in the same situation. Here's the blue rug. We're going to consistently shock him when he hears the sign of the bell. So he learns. Now we're going to put him in the box. Now he learns. Now when he's in the floor is blue, he will automatically freeze because he's anticipating the shock happening when nothing happens. Now what happens now, we're going to generalize this. Now notice what happens now when he gets into the third box. The third box, you notice the floor is purple. And what does he do? He begins to behave abnormally. where he should be on his hind legs sniffing around because he's curious about his new environment, bingo, he freezes. So you can condition a person to learn to fear. That can happen. And that can happen psychologically, although there's a physiological basis to that for happening. So we know, for an example, so we look at emotions as response patterns. We see here, for an example, the amygdala is the organ that's involved in human emotional responses. And we know that when there are lesions to the amygdala, the patient will experience decreased emotional responses. This is called White's disease, where the amygdala is destroyed, but the patient lose their ability to fear. So things that, so in other words, things that we normally are afraid of, some people are afraid of, maybe afraid of heights, or some people are afraid of dogs or whatever. When the amygdala is damaged, you will lose your ability to fear things. So we know now that fear or lesions can impair a conditioned emotional responding. So in other words, if I go back to the previous slide, here, if we damage here, so if we damage this animal's amygdala, he will not, even though he will get shot, but he will therefore show no fear, particularly down here, especially after he's been shot. So we put him in the blue box, he will show no fear whatsoever. So he's not gonna freeze. Now he's gonna be curious like he was when he's gonna be curious like he was here. So in other words, when the amygdala is damaged, you lose your ability to fear. Okay. So there were some studies done way back in 2004. Phelps and his colleagues took the sample of animal studies, and what he did in his subjects in 2004, he used human subjects, and he basically found the same thing. That humans it's the same region of the brain that can cause that same emotional responses in humans as animals. So here we go. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex, okay? This part of your brain includes the medial orbital frontal. The orbital frontal cortex is right behind your eyeballs. So the area of your brain immediately behind your eyeballs is called the orbital frontal cortex, and the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. These are pathways that lead subcortically that project into the prefrontal cortex. When this region of your brain is damaged, you will lose your ability to analyze complex social situations, or in other words, you have a very difficult time relating to people in your environment. You will have problems interpreting their intent. So frontal lobe damage can be very, very complex, because we understand and we know that this region of your brain is responsible for complex social behavior, complex decision-making, problem solving, and so forth. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. So here, we also know that this region of the brain plays a very, very important part in regulating serious emotional responses. So people who are very impulsive violently, okay, tend to have what we call emotional regulation problem. It means that there may not be damage to the frontal cortex specifically, or there may not be damage, for an example, to the amygdala specifically. However, there could be a pathway problem. In other words, the pathways, the neural pathways that lead from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex, those are the ones that are damaged. And we find this in children with attention deficit disorder. Children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder tend to have an impulse control problem because the anterior cingulate is damaged. And so they have a very difficult time regulating their behaviors, so they become hyper. And there is a difference between ADHD and ADD. I don't have time to go into that today, but maybe at another time we can talk about that. Once again, when we're frustrated, most of the time, most of us can cool down. We can just walk away. We can walk away from the situation. But when you have frontal lobe damage in the area of the brain that I'm talking about, you lose that ability. And so your anger just increases. Anything that you say, it will only frustrate the person even more. Okay. So this is the region in green that you're looking at. This is the region that I'm just talking about. This area is called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is a schematic diagram for you, a table that shows you, again, the brain behavior relationship. Again, we look at 3 areas of the brain that we're talking about today. 1, the central nucleus of the amygdala, the lateral nucleus of the amygdala, and of course, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And you can see the behavioral correlates of each area of the brain. Once again, the amygdala plays a specific role in provoking anger and violent emotional reactions. And we find that the amygdala it matures very early in neurodevelopment. So it's easier to see that by the time the child reaches adolescence, and sometimes adolescents are described as being very moody, they have difficult time regulating their emotion. They tend to be more aggressive with each other. And one of the reasons is because the amygdala develops faster than the prefrontal cortex. So with adolescents, they are more emotional because that region of the brain is more active during adolescence. As the child grows older, and the frontal lobes begin to become more mature, then they tend to have a better regulation of their emotional responses. Now, when a person gets into adulthood and the person is still having difficulty regulating emotional control, that's the time that patient needs to see a neurologist or a psychiatrist. The prefrontal cortex, as I just said, matures much later, during late childhood and early adulthood. And by the way, your frontal cortex matures all the way into your late 40s. So it's part of your brain that continues to mature even into middle age. Next, I want to talk about aggression. So we finished with talking about the regions of the brain that talk about fear responses and so forth. We also talked about how fear can be conditioned. We'll move on to aggression. And when we talk about aggression specifically, we're talking about species typical behavior. And when we look at this, many acts of aggression, particularly among animals and so forth, tend to be related to either aggressive behavior we see, for example, threat behavior, defensive behaviors, submissive behaviors, all related to primarily reproduction. And of course, there's predation. That is attacking without any rhyme or reason. So here, again, we talk about threat behaviors. We're talking about, again, stereotypical species typical behavior. And I want to stop for just a brief second by saying that for children in pre-K programs, how do we identify children in preschool programs that may be at risk? The answer to that is follow that child's developmental trajectory, but you also want to follow that child's neurodevelopmental trajectory, because the behavior that's being displayed may not be typical for that child's developmental level or neurodevelopmental level. So threat behaviors, these are species typical behavior that warns another animal that it may be attacked if it doesn't submit. Defensive behavior, again, species typical behavior in which an animal will defend itself against the threat of other animals. And then of course there's submissive behaviors, animals showing a response to a threat behavior by showing threat behavior. And this serves as to prevent the animal from attacking. And sometimes they'll just expose their jugular vein, which is typically seen among wolves and so forth, in which an animal shows submissive behavior. And of course, predation, this type of behavior, of course, when the animals are threatened. So they may go into another animal's territory just to get food. And usually with animals, it does involve food. So this is what I mean by this situation. And here, as I showed you the neuroanatomy of fear, here you can see, ladies and gentlemen, this is the neurocircuitry of aggression. And notice I'm talking about basically the same regions of the brain, the amygdala. And again, we're focusing our attention, specific attention to the central nucleus, the basal nucleus, and the medial nucleus of the amygdala. And the arrows that you're looking at are pathways that, as you can see, flows into where? Flows in again into the prefrontal cortex. We have a dorsal stream, which is responsible for defensive behavior. And we have the ventral stream, which is involved with predation. And this studies go back from 2017. So this is the neurocircuitry of aggression. So once again, behavior tends to be more of a physiological that can be modified by psychological processes as well. And then we're going to take a look at 5-hydroxytryptophan, otherwise known as serotonin. Chemically, it's known as 5-HT. There is just an overwhelming amount of evidence in the literature that shows that the activity of serotonergic synapses will inhibit aggression. So in other words, it seems that serotonin plays a role in the reduction of aggression or modifying aggression as well. And I won't read all these studies to you. This is just a highlight to show you that that we now know we can actually point to a specific neurotransmitter in the brain, and we can see that it has an enormous impact as it relates to aggression. And we can use agonists, for an example. There are some agonists, serotonin agonists. These are SSRI inhibitors, or an agonist that will increase the level of serotonin in the brain. Fluoxetine is one, or is otherwise known as Prozac, is an agonist that will increase the production of serotonin in the brain. And when that happens, the patient experiences decreased irritability and aggressiveness as measured by psychological tests. And this is a schematic diagram that shows you that when the levels of serotonin is low in your brain, these animals, these were monkeys, and what you're looking at, the blue arrows show, monkeys, especially weaker monkeys, will never, ever, ever attack a stronger monkey. It just won't happen. They tend to know their place in society. This diagram shows you that when serotonin levels are low in their brain, as measured by 5-HI, this is 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid, and which is a metabolite of 5-HT. We see that a large number of these animals engage in very, very risky behavior. And you can see, for an example, a large number of these animals ended up dead because they just engage in risky behavior. Now, notice as there are increases in serotonin in the brain, notice now that the line comes down significant. I mean, so they begin to not be aggressive, and they tend to stay in their place. And the same thing with alive. There are many of these animals remained alive, but you can see the values will increase significantly as the levels go down.
Dr. Vuo.
Yes.
I'm wondering, just in the interest of time, first of all, my response to all of this is, wow, this is fun and this is really good. But in the interest of time, if you could summarize, I'd love you to come back on 2 occasions where we can do a whole program like this. And also, I want you to come to our Wednesday night meeting. This is good. I love this.
Okay. All right. Well, let me summarize. Let me summarize fast. Let me show some pictures really fast. Let me do this. All right. So let me see. Talk about TBI. Okay, so I can't really.
And I have a question that
okay.
Is there any, and I understand that race is a social political construct.
Yes.
Is there any consideration or involvement of race in what you're saying here, or is this generalized to animals and people in general?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. And so let me say this. As far as the physiological, biological aspects, the science is relatively solid and consistent regarding the areas of the brain that are affected. What concerns me more when it comes to the social political term of race is how environmental factors can play a significant role in the level of violence of those who are subjected to these psychological political factors in our environments. We don't, so when you add in, for an example, poverty, when you add in poor education, when you add in lack of resources, when you add into, and let me just go back to just briefly what I said before about predation. When animals attack other animals, in other words, when they cross into their territory, it's normally because there's the issue pertains to food. I mean, there's something out there that they recognize that's needed for their biological survival. Now, if you take that same dynamic and you place it, for an example, in impoverished neighborhoods where you may have high crime, well, it would make sense. You're going to have high crime if families can't afford to provide for their families. So they're going to turn to, for an example, criminal activities, if you will. They will engage in predative type of behaviors, not because that they're inclined or this is their natural ability. They're doing it primarily out of survival.
Dr. Neighbor Stevens and Dr. Waltz, I'd like you to both weigh in if you would.
I think the thought that I'm pondering, and yes, let me say this has been a fantastic presentation and one that really needs a lot more time to fully understand and appreciate. But we started this off, we kind of said it in the tone, in the text of the school violence and what have you.
Yes.
So can you take us to how these formative brains are impacted by what they are either directly or indirectly experiencing in our society vis-a-vis school shootings, neighborhood shootings, et cetera?
Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. And the answer to that question is when we get into preventive medicine, looking at and paying more careful attention to the antenatal period, the environment in which the child's first environment, which is the womb, and we need to explore the secondary environment in which the child comes into the world. Remember, psychological factors can enhance levels of violence. This we know. I wrote an article here for the Miami Times on violence and brain injury. And in that article, I explained and showed that children who are simply exposed to violence can cause brain damage. So when we're cognizant of these antenatal factors, these teratogenic factors, X-rays, microwave ovens, and so forth, and how they can have a negative impact on that developing brain. This is what I mean when I say in preschool programs, if we become more aware of how these things can affect the developing brain, perhaps we can then provide earlier intervention for these children.
So Dr. V, this is absolutely fascinating. I want to jump on Dr. Maxey's bus for a minute and just say that Dr. Maxey mentioned that we would like to have you come back 2 more times. And I think, and here's why I think that makes perfect sense. Following Dr. Maxey is always a good idea. And what you've given us is a good understanding of what normal biology and physiology is like. And I think we need to get into what causes damage. There are a couple of questions in the chat about if you damage this part, what can happen, or how you damage that. As a former public health officer, I know we talked a lot about getting lead out of homes because of exposure to lead can cause problems with development and what have you. So that would be, so the first one, tell us what healthy looks like and how it works. You've done a lot of that. The second one, how does it get hurt and what causes damage? And then the third one is, what can we do? How can we recognize that there's something wrong and then move forward. I would split it up into those 3 sections and feel that we've gotten an introduction with the first section, have you come back to do the second and come back to do the third, if all that makes sense.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. And, you know, I again want to commend, I want to commend Dr. Maxey for this format is so important. I mean, you know, him and I lost contact with each other there for a while. I thought he didn't want me. I thought he didn't like me anymore, but it seems like he loves me. So I mean, I can deal with that. But yeah, I mean, it's a good idea to allow me to come in where I can really spend time in breaking these things down. I'm writing my 3rd book now, and the book I'm writing now addresses issues in early childhood programs, which I believe are quite significant to what we can do to circumvent some of these problems that occur with our children. I would love to see more early childhood programs embrace, you know, parents and talk about preventative medicine, to talk about some of the things that help them to understand that there is a developing nervous system going on, and, you know, healthy environments, good connections with fathers and mothers, and good prenatal care, nutrition, the whole 9 yards, and what we can do as a community to prevent these type of things from happening as well. From there, then we can talk about risk factors in early childhood programs, beginning with infancy. I did a presentation on Friday to a group of educators, and I was talking about the topic of discussion we talked about dyslexia. And one of the things I was talking about in that particular session was that when does dyslexia begin? Dyslexia is a reading disorder, but it is a neurological disorder. Dyslexia is not an academic problem. Dyslexia is a neurological problem. And so I was telling them that when a child is dyslexic, the research shows that children are dyslexic in the in the first trimester of pregnancy. They are not dyslexic when they go to school. So then when a child enters kindergarten programs with dyslexia, the child is already 5 years behind his or her peers. 5 years because the problem started in the womb. So when a child reaches kindergarten in 1st grade and teachers say, well, for an example, you hear teachers sometimes say, well, he's in the 2nd grade. Well, he's on the 1st grade level. No, ma'am. That child is now 6 years behind his peers. So grade level statistics are very weak statistically. They are not the strongest statistic. When you look at standardized scores, you want to look at standard scores and not grade level scores.
So, Dr. Voual, I know we're short of time, but I just want one more person to make a brief comment.
Sure.
And that is Dr. Gary Dennis, if he's on. Dr. Dennis, are you on as our resident neurosurgeon?
I see Dr. Dennis is on, Dr. Maxey. He is muted at the moment. And I also see that Attorney Alicia Rochelle has raised her hand.
Okay, Dr.
Yes, hi. I had a quick question that may, that kind of came to mind in light of the recent Supreme Court decision. Was a young lady who said that because of an assault, she had a baby in a state where it was very religious, very much a red state, and she delivered the child. But during the period of gestation, she experienced severe depression and just deep, almost debilitating depression. And once the child was born, it was very agitated. It couldn't be calmed a lot of times. And then she said that as the child grew, it had developmental problems. And right now, the child is, I think, a teenager that can't be kept at home. And she said that that was because of what she described as a hostile womb or something. Is that, number one, is that a thing? And number two, in light of the recent court decisions, has the medical community and pediatrics and et cetera, neurosciences and things, have you considered the decision for Roe v. Wade and how that may affect your profession?
Was
That's
that
for
for me?
you, Dr. V.
Yes.
Oh, for me. Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Ms. Rochelle.
That's
Well,
okay.
it does have an impact. The disruption of normal biological processes can definitely have an impact on the child. It can have an impact on the mother as well. Changes like postpartum depression, for an example, are likely the result of hormonal imbalances in the body, where you have this imbalance and these imbalances in these neurochemicals called hormones can certainly affect the mood. I mean, there's no question about that. Children with developmental issues, once again, I say we begin with the first environment. As I said, I'm writing another book now, and I'm specifically talking about the two environments. And the first environment, which is the one that we really talk about, is the mother's womb. That's the first environment. And then secondly would be the secondary environment, and this would be the environment that the child grows into. So if you have children who have some type of disruption during the developmental periods of the nervous system, and the prognosis tends to be poorer when the secondary environment is antithetical to that child's optimal brain development.
So, Doctor, I know we sort of want to go to our second speaker, but before you go, I noticed is Dr. Exlina Bean, who is one of our world-class pediatricians, does she have a comment?
And we did get Dr. Dennis unmuted, Dr. Maxey.
Okay. So Dr. Dennis and Dr. Bean, we have a short comment from each of you.
This is Dr. Dennis. Thanks, you're doing a great job. Difficult with all these things going on in America today. But there's a huge number of case studies on adult and teenage violence, which more or less demonstrate and verify these connections that have also been identified in animal studies. And there have been a number of scientific ways of attempting to study these. It's often sometimes very difficult to get permission to do the studies because nobody will agree to it. I tried to do a study at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and it got into a whole lot of red tape. All the people were interested in the study never got a chance to really perform it. And a lot of it had to do with fear of what might happen with the social, psychological entries that they already sustained. But it's an area that needs more research. But it also needs some systematic way of looking at these problems. And I think that, I'll give you a good example of one. 25-year-old.
I need you to be brief, Dr. Dennis.
Okay, 25-year-old man in an accident, hit his head, got a subdural hematoma, blood clot. Had to have surgery to remove it. It was removed. But what happened to this man is that he started developing more and more aggressive tendencies. His EEG was abnormal, which showed he had some brainwave activity that he undoubtedly did not have before. And he ended up being accused of murder. In fact, he was jail, and in fact, he actually lost the case that they had against him. But anyway, it was very difficult, and it was all due to the stimulation of the amygdala and the temporal lobe, and which caused it to occur. And so that's just an example. There are lots of case study information that would help understand better. But I think you have to add something like this to one of your programs to get the treatment for it.
So we're definitely going to do that. And I appreciate Dr. Dennis's former head of neurosurgery at Howard. Dr. Bean, can you unmute for a minute before we go to our next?
Yes. I thought, yes, can you hear me?
Doctor, you were asking Dr. Bean to unmute, Dr.
Yes.
Maxey? Okay,
Yep.
Dr. Bean is unmuted. Go ahead, Dr. Bean.
No, the only comment, thank you very much. This is very, very interesting, very elegant kind of studies. One of the questions, of course, is that they're looking at this concept of epigenetics and how stress, especially going back to the concept of whether in utero environments can actually impact the fetus and subsequent child. And they have shown that stress in and of itself impacts at the epigenetic level, the actual DNA expression in patients, and that it is heritable, that you can actually transmit that to the next generation. And I find that extremely interesting. And of course, especially looking at the intergenerational problems we often have or often see around the issues of violence. And so the other thing is that African Americans, and Harry being one of them, are beginning to get more and more involved at looking at repositories of genetic material and asking and I think it'd be an interesting discussion for one of your sessions on the issue of the genetics, the risk, the benefits, et cetera, of doing that. And I know that all of the HBCUs have been asked to participate with Regenerist, and I always get a little bit, antsy when you're talking about a corporate entity around this issue.
Thank you. Dr. Bean, where are you academically located? Meharry.
I'm at Meharry Medical College, which is one of the HBCUs that is involved, but so is Howard, and so is Morehouse, and probably Drew as well, as far as I know. But that is a new initiative that they're looking at. But going back to the original subject, and my first comments, which were around the issue of whether or not stress could in fact be in utero, could in fact the genetics expression of children. And at some point, we'd love for somebody to say something about, well, what kind of intervention can you do, especially in early childhood, to see about mitigating some of these effects. Thanks.
Okay, let me see if I can take executive privilege. And Dr. B, if you can stay with us, I'd like Dr. Barbara Neighbors-Stevens to introduce our other speaker.
Yes,
and
I will.
Let's have a follow-up at the end and get into some of these subjects. But
I can't wait to hear her.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm very happy to have someone who knows the subject and is not just spouting off opinion, as so many people on TV seem to be. I too want to take an executive privilege and just make the comment that we're just catching up. And I will remind everyone that it is referenced in the Bible of marking the baby. So we'll talk about that at some other time. So our next speaker is here to address this very timely subject, which is the impact of this recent announcement of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade. And our speaker, Ms. Alicia Rochelle, Attorney Rochelle, is a graduate of the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff and shares the distinction of being a graduate of the Howard University School of Law, along with our esteemed Vice President. Attorney Rochelle currently serves as co-director of Dr. Shalon's, I hope I said that right, Maternal Action Project, an organization aimed at increasing awareness of the Black maternal health crisis and the development and promotion of evidence-based strategies that improve health outcomes for Black women. Without further ado, we turn it over now to Attorney Rochelle.
We need to unmute Attorney Rochelle.
Yes.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to chat with you guys for a moment at this, what most of us, I think, can agree is one of the darker weeks of the year that we've had to experience with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And Dr. Maxey, at Dr. Maxey's request, I'm coming to briefly inform about what this means. Essentially, the Roe v. Wade decision means that states are allowed to ban abortion at any time, at any stage of gestation. And the most immediate impact is that they're free to restrict or ban abortions if they choose. And that leaves its citizens open and susceptible, obviously, to having their bodies governed by the state. Now, a little background on Roe v. Wade. That was the landmark decision wherein a pregnant woman in Texas was sued, where her name was Jane Roe. She sued Henry Wade, who was the district attorney for Dallas County, about a law that Texas had in place that said a woman could not have an abortion unless the mother's life was at risk. Her life, Jane Roe's life, was not at risk. She just didn't want to be a mother. She didn't want to have a baby. So, of course, as we learned, and this is a landmark decision where the Supreme Court found in Roe's favor and said that that was an infringement on her right to privacy, which one of the most private things that we can do is decide whether or not we want, when and whether we want to have children. But in the opinion, the majority opinion given by Judge Bruner, he did set forth a trimester framework, so to speak, where in the first trimester, the woman has an absolute right to an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy. And from there, in the second trimester, she had a right to an abortion so long as her life was at risk, but the states couldn't ban it. That was a decision that would be made between she and her physician. After that, in the last trimester, where viability is more likely than not, then she did not have a right to, the states can rather prohibit her right to an abortion. And what was happening from 73 all up into the early 90s, what happened was states would put various burdens on women to justify their having an abortion. And repeatedly, it was being presented to the Supreme Court. One such state was Pennsylvania, where in 1992, the state of Pennsylvania put forth several, I want to call it burdens, but that's not it. Several rules, I'll say, for a woman to have to satisfy in order to get an abortion. One was that she had to get informed consent, and if it was a minor child, they had to get the parents' permission. But one was requiring physicians to have these things on file, that she got informed consent from the physician and that she informed her husband that she intended to have the procedure. And that if the woman did not do that, then the physicians had a duty to report her for failing to do so. So that was the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And in that, the Supreme Court again confirmed, and this was brought by the physicians of Planned Parenthood and a couple of other physicians against the state, stating that, or the district attorney, Casey, stating that, asking whether requiring a woman to inform her husband before having an abortion was constitutional. And they ruled in favor of the physicians, stating that she did not have the burden stating that the state putting forth the burden for her to inform her husband would not be constitutional. And they struck that down. Now, the previously mentioned trimester framework, however, was also overturned. And what in a three-panel decision, 3 of the Supreme Court justices set that framework ideology aside and said, okay, it's fine for the states to regulate the conditions under which a woman can get an abortion, so long as it does not substantially interfere with her right to end her pregnancy prior to the baby's viability. And that took on a life of its own. Now comes Dobbs, which is where Mississippi, this last decision, which is overturned Roe v. Wade. Dobbs was put in place because of, was brought before the court because the state of Mississippi signed what is called a Gestational Age Act, which banned any abortion operation after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy, with exceptions for a medical emergency or severe fetal abnormality, but they had no exceptions for rape or incest. The medical emergency exception only allowed abortions done to save the life of the pregnant woman, and in situations where continuation of the pregnancy would create serious risk of substantial and irreversible impairment of a major bodily function. And that the severe fetal abnormality is essentially stating that the fetuses would be born with such defects that would leave them incapable of living outside the womb. The governor of Mississippi, in this climate of everyone's pro-life and especially post-Trump, the governor of Mississippi kind of politicized this a bit by saying that he wanted to make it, what was the quote? He was committed to making Mississippi the safest place in America for an unborn child, and this bill will help them achieve that goal. He said we'll probably sue in the next 5 minutes, but it'll be worth it. Once that bill passed, Jackson Women's Health Organization successfully sued the state health officer, with his name is Thomas Dobbs. And the district court found in favor of Jackson, citing Roe. And they said that the state of Mississippi had no legitimate state interest strong enough prior to viability to justify a ban on abortions. Dobbs wanted to present evidence that fetuses can feel pain at 15 weeks, but the district court ruled that inadmissible and irrelevant. The state appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and they affirmed the district court's decision, stating that this has been long established that prior to viability, a woman has the right to terminate a pregnancy, has a right to an abortion. Then Mississippi came back and issued a stricter injunction called which is essentially like Texas, a heartbeat bill, which forbade abortions when a fetal heartbeat could be detected, which is usually at 6 to 12 weeks. The Fifth Circuit upheld that second injunction, just like before. They said with the first law and the second law, both of them, it's already decided. A stare decisis, the decision stands. The state successfully appealed to the Supreme Court, and that's what happened. The Supreme Court, in his majority opinion, Judge Alito, said that there is no constitutional right to an abortion. And he is right. There is no enumerated or articulated right in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution saying that you have a right to an abortion. But that was, in my opinion, a play on words. That, my opinion, and many other scholars, obviously. It doesn't say that, like Dr. Maxey said, it doesn't say that you have the right to own an AK-47. It doesn't say that you have a right to marriage or any of that. But those rights are protected under what is called a Penumbra of Rights, which are rights that are not clearly articulated in the Constitution, but they are implied by the laws as written. Obviously, at the time the Constitution was written, they couldn't anticipate all of the various things that we have. The internet, we have, so many things that have changed, obviously, since the Constitution was signed. So when he said you don't have a constitutional right to abortion, the right to an abortion, or the right to body autonomy, or the right to interracial marriage, or the right to any of this is protected under the right of privacy implied under the First Amendment, freedom of association. So now that we have watched them summarily dismiss the right of a woman to have bodily autonomy, that means that every other case that was decided that cited Roe v. Wade, and every other case that falls under that penumbra of rights that are not clearly articulated in the Constitution, but are implied by the Constitution, is up for grabs. That means separate but equal. That means, which that was a horrible example. Plessy versus Ferguson was one of the worst decisions ever made. That's a conversation for another day. But the right to a same-sex marriage, the right to contraceptives, all of that is what's on the table as a result of Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Wow.
Thank you so
Thank-
much. I have, as all of us, have been mulling over this, not just since Friday, but since the leak occurred about a month ago.
Mhm.
And I would like to put forward the theory that this is the culmination of a strategy that has been in play for 50 years, ever since the beginning of the decision. If that is accepted, then I would say that the lesson, the number one lesson out of all of this is for us to understand that you can make your agenda happen, but you have to put forward a plan of action that works. So having stated that, then I would not take the position that all is lost, but ask, what kind of a strategy do we need to put in play from this point forward to achieve an overturn or a correction of this decision and all of the, and I won't say unintended, all the other potential consequences that can come if the doctrine is applied as you have so eloquently explained?
Well, the way that the judicial system is structured with the Supreme Court, these are lifetime appointments, which is why it was, and obviously you're going to look at, in every presidential election, you have to look at the Supreme Court and see which seats are more likely to come up for vacancy. And Kennedy was retired. Ginsburg passed away. The seat that was vacated by not Alito, Scalia, was that Scalia?
The one that died in Texas.
Yeah, that's Scalia. Was never filled. Merrick Garland, Obama tried to get him on Supreme Court, but he was not successful. So the only certain ones that we only have three certain ones who are certain to be liberal or who generally rule liberally. The remaining ones, the six, are going to toe the line, as they've shown us with the Miranda requirement, the fact that the police officers cannot be sued civilly or criminally if they fail to read an individual their Miranda rights, even if it results in that person's conviction, and the evidence is still admissible. So your Fourth Amendment rights or your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, all that is on the chopping block or has been severely limited. They expanded the gun laws. So in answer to your question, it took them 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I suspect that it will take about as much to overturn that Jackson and Dobbs. It will be seismic. Now, I see there are a lot of physicians that are on today, the way that this will affect the physicians places a heavier burden on the physician than it does on the patient. Most of the states, 18 right now, 18 of the states have a near total ban on abortions. I'm sad to say that I'm from one of them. So what that means is, like, I think 11 of them had trigger laws, which essentially had laws on the books ready to go that says as soon as the Supreme Court overturns Roe, abortions are going to be severely limited. Now, by severely limited, for example, in Arkansas, abortions are illegal after the period of quickening, which I'd never heard of. I don't know what quickening is, maybe you guys, but it says it usually occurs between 16 to 20 weeks into pregnancy. It will be unlawful for anyone to perform an abortion on a woman unless her life is in danger. Now, as a physician, I know that you guys have to make life or death decisions all the time, but we in the legal field pay attention to the wording there. Unless her life is in danger. Yeah, she could lose a kidney, but the other side, the state could argue, but did she die? Was her life at risk? She had another kidney. Severe organ failure. Anything, they can successfully argue what is the worst that could have happened. Would she have died? And no physician, understandably, they'll be second guessing themselves as to whether this is something that could actually kill the mother in a lot of these jurisdictions. They give no regard to whether the child was conceived in rape or incest. They give no regard to the child's age. They give no regard to the mother. In fact, in some states, if it comes down to whether you should save the child or the mother, the child is the one that's the most important, and the mother is almost expendable. So there are a lot of things that are coming out of this. And if a physician does, perform an abortion, they face 6 to 10 years in prison, $100,000 fine, and the revocation of their license and their ability to practice medicine. And right now, like Mississippi said that they are wanting this to be the safest place for an unborn child to live. The state of Missouri has said that we want to have the strictest anti-abortion laws in the land. And it is downright terrifying considering the draconian laws that I've been reading in preparation for today and post, Roe being overturned. I shudder to think what they're going to come up with. Missouri also has a portion of their law where if the people who conceive the child aren't Mississippi residents and the woman or the child is conceived in Missouri, the law could be stretched to bring them to prosecution if that child is aborted. They're trying to figure out ways to do that. So the only thing that is kind of a bit of thing that can help women is that obviously in these states, there are laws that prohibit, like in Arkansas, it will be unlawful for any person to administer or prescribe any medication or drug to any woman with child with the intent to produce an abortion or premature delivery of any fetus before or after the period of quickening or to produce or attempt to produce the abortion by any other means. So they're basically saying you can't take anything, ingest anything that would cause the child to not be carried to term and terminate the pregnancy. That is the only real out that a woman would have if she suspected that she's pregnant, is to take a pill to prevent the child from coming to term. There are some nonprofit organizations that have organized ways for these women who live in jurisdictions where it's prohibited. They can have it sent to an address in a blue state where abortions are still legal, and then somehow get that package from that address sent to them in the red state. So there are a lot of things here, and with the drug, drug that you can take to cause the abortion, it is, in most of those states, they can't control how people get their hands on heroin, cocaine, or whatever. So it would be very difficult for them to find it. But if there is evidence that she has ingested it, if it was given by accident by someone else, there's really, it's at this point, anyone's guess how many ways this is going to ripple into the legal community and the criminal system as a result.
If I can ask you a question, I want you to prognosticate past Roe v. Wade. What other freedoms are on the block, in your opinion?
Well, Clarence Thomas clearly said in his concurrence in Dobbs versus Jackson, he said, next, we need to address contraceptives and same-sex marriage. That's what he said. They have been very clear from the very beginning that they were going to go after Roe v. Wade. That was always something that they said that they were going to do.
Is our citizenship on the block, meaning communities of color? Are you going to take away Dr. Ivanwal's right?
I have absolutely no idea. I'm so floored by reading through law after law after law, where they have absolutely no intention of giving a woman the option of terminating a pregnancy that was forced on her, either from rape or incest. It is absolutely out. I'm literally at a loss for words. And I'm shocked at, there was a law in Tennessee recently that made it to the General Assembly, thank goodness it wasn't passed, where they're trying to get rid of the age of consent. The age of consent, as everyone knows, is 18 when a woman is considered of legal age to consent to anything that happens. They tried to get rid of that. There's absolutely no telling. I shudder to think about it. And further, especially for communities of color, they severely cut Planned Parenthood funding. And with us, most African Americans live in the South. Most of the red states in the South most of the red states are in the South and Midwest. The ones with the heartbeat bill and the ones that are trying to impose criminal liability on a person for driving someone to get an abortion, from assisting in any way, from giving money to someone to get an abortion, all of this, anyone that's associated with it. Now that Roe has been overturned, the states, the Supreme Court has given the power to the states to do whatever they wish. There is no more, regard for the actual woman that this is going to affect.
But is that not the biggest opportunity to focus on making change at the state level in terms of your legislators and governors, as opposed to the Supreme Court? Although we have a question in the chat that says, that is asking, is there a legal path to changing the process at which Supreme Court justices are confirmed? For example, vote by Congress? No. Or an elect. I'm saying that because the Tennessee people, the Florida people, you don't want them voting on it, at least the current ones. Vote by Congress members, or an election process that allows for citizens to vote for Supreme Court justices rather than the current confirmation process and permanent seating of judges. Is there a legal path towards changing the process for the appointment of the Supreme Court justices?
I'd like to know about the amygdala of Justice Thomas.
I'm sorry, there's a question, Mr. Jordan.
Well, before while Dr. Jordan is being unmuted, I think it's a really important question. Is there, because what we've heard is that you can add more Supreme Court justices. They talked about packing the court. is there another route where the Supreme Court can be not for life? Is there, can all the states decide we want to change it? Because I know constitutional amendments can be done to change the Constitution. So just dig into that a little bit for us. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah. The Supreme Court is, unlike the, right to privacy and all that, the Supreme Court is part of the Constitution, and it is something that is appointed by the president, and it's confirmed by the representatives, which is why it was so difficult for Obama to get Merrick Garland onto the court, was because the Senate and the House were heavily Republican. Or the Senate was heavily Republican. So there was no way he could have put anybody in front of them, and there was absolutely no way that he was going to be able to put him on the court, because the Republican Party toes the line. They don't have anybody out there screaming butter emails and Bernie and bust. They don't have all that. They see on the grander scale that the Supreme Court has much bigger sway. So in response to your question, there has been a lot of outcry about expanding the Supreme Court to have more justices. There has been abolish the Supreme Court, but it would take so many amendments. It's not like case law, like, Roe is decided and now, it's overturned by another case. It's not like that at all. Because it's in the Constitution, it would be a lot more difficult to happen. It would be a lot more difficult, and no one could have stare decisis. Yeah. Stare decisis. Roe, it is downright terrifying. If you look at cases just under penumbra of law, if you look at the cases that were decided that way, and I think I still have them up, okay, the definition of cruel and unusual punishment is not limited to what authors of the Constitution understood that concept to mean, laying the groundwork for the idea that constitutional interpretation should not be limited solely to the culture and beliefs of original authors. No, that's not it. Hold on. Griswold versus Connecticut. Connecticut's laws against distribution of contraceptives and contraceptive information to married couples were struck down under the right to privacy. Again, the penumbra or umbrella of the Constitution, meaning that it's not necessarily stated implicitly in the Constitution. It's implied based on the intent of its authors. Loving versus Virginia, where the Virginia law against interracial marriages was struck down. And of course, Roe V Wade. And there are just so many that are based on this. And it takes a lot of time for a case to be right. It has to be tried in state court, then it has to be appealed, and it has to be appealed to district court, and then it makes it to Supreme Court. So I think those of us who were kind of in the mix knew what was at stake when Hillary and Trump were running. And this is exactly the nightmare that we imagined. Now, when it comes to African-American women, Dr. Shalon's Maternal Action Project is one that I'm co-director of. I've been doing this for probably about a year. And this woman was brilliant. She was extremely educated. She had her child, and she kept going back to the doctor because she knew something was wrong. Her legs were swollen. She just had all kinds of horrible things that were happening. She knew something was wrong. They kept telling her, oh, you just had a baby, go home. And she went home and she died 3 weeks later due to complications of high blood pressure. Everyone is, I think, becoming more and more aware of how Black women are, in the saying is that doctors are to Black women what police are to Black men. Mm-hmm. And I cannot tell you how many times I have had to put my foot down and ask for additional testing. And I was right in doing so. I can't tell you, and I'm a person that's reasonably intelligent, I would like to think, and I can tell when something is wrong with me. But recently they asked a group of doctors, or a study was done where they asked a group of doctors what their feelings were about Black women as patients of these medical students. And they said that they believe that Black women experience pain differently. And they also don't believe that we experience it as intensely as other races. And more often than not, they're inclined to believe that we want pain medicine because we're addicted to drugs, not because we're actually in pain. So, like the saying, when America gets a cold, the Black community gets pneumonia. I mentioned that Black people, majority of Black people live in the Southern United States, in the places where they're implementing the heartbeat law and all these other anti-abortion stances. They've cut Planned Parenthood. And most of these are in places where most Black people live. So the implication is going to be seismic in our community, because not only will we not have access to healthcare, we will not have access to abortions if they think that there is a possibility, a sliver of a possibility that they can save that child's life. And physicians will be reluctant to recommend, or will at least at best second guess themselves in those jurisdictions. If they say, okay, I can go and be a physician in a blue state where I can practice medicine to the benefit of my patients, instead of going down to a red state where I'm going to have to be dragged into litigation every time I decide what's best for my patient. He'll opt to go somewhere else, and that may result in the reduction of medical professionals in those areas. We just don't know.
I think the long-term consequences of this are very frightening. The only good point that I personally see out of this, I think it was very important that somebody like Trump be elected and that this kind of decision be made so that our community will wake up and understand we cannot sit back and expect the largesse of so-called America to look out for us. If we don't wake up and do what we have to do and vote at all levels of politics and society, and not just come out every 4 years to vote for Obama or Biden or whatnot, we are going to be toast. What do you think, Dr. Walks?
Someone asked if it's a lifetime appointment. Yes.
So Dr. Maxey, before I make my comment, Dr. Jordan had been trying to get on for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. And you're from Arkansas?
I
Good.
am.
'Cause I'm from Wheatley.
Oh, wow. I'm from Rising.
Okay, two small town people.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've forgotten what integration was like. People didn't just the next day turn over. All of this really goes back to states' rights.
Mm-hmm.
And George Wallace ran for president on states' rights. States had the right to decide when to integrate. States had the right to decide if Blacks and whites could marry, etc. And it took a lot for us to finally get into the opposite. I mean, the majority of people who voted for Trump were white women. So I think we have a lot to deal with, but we need to look at history again. This is scary, but I think what Randall said is very true. Hopefully it can wake us up, but we have to really be the ones making sure that we get people to think and do things. But people keep forgetting that all of this began, and Eastman was one of the senators from Mississippi. The whole point of it was saving the white race. And they didn't want white women having babies. And it's like we keep forgetting that. I mean, people don't think about Black women having babies, but white couples, the number of white couples wanting to adopt is greater than the number of babies in this country. And that is one of the driving things that we have to realize is that there are other issues that are there, and saving the white race is one, and providing babies, because any white woman having an abortion, the baby can be adopted out. You're not worried about whatever happened to the black kid. But I think we have to really wake up and get back into this a lot more than I think we have. I'm glad you're on. I'm coming to Arkansas in July, and I'll stay 2 days and I'm gone.
Yeah, you better stay in
And
the
not
AC.
only that,
As far
not only
as there being any change, let's see what Trump's the Supreme Court does as president initiated change. Nothing is the answer to what trumps the Supreme Court. Nothing. That's why it is imperative that we stop paying attention to, we have to look at the greater issue. A friend of mine told me that her daughter doesn't even take any sort of civics classes. She's in junior high. She doesn't take civics classes. They don't even offer it anymore. She doesn't know about the judicial, legislative, the executive, doesn't know anything about that anymore. That's not part of the curriculum anymore. There is an active and very present effort to keep us in the dark as to how we live and what controls our lives. There is also, being Black and female, it can be a bit of a struggle because you're a double minority. You're a member of one minority that will put race, that sometimes, a lot of times, put race before gender. And then you have the other side that puts gender before race. And so we, as far as us going out and trying to tell people, it took the Black female contingency to make sure that Roy Moore, a sexual predator for all intents and purposes in Alabama, to make sure that he didn't get re-elected.
Yes.
Like it's almost like every time something goes amok, people finally start to receive or at least acknowledge what the Black female contingency has been saying all along. 86% of Black women voted for Hillary or did not vote for Trump. Okay? 54% of white women did.
Yes.
54%. And there has been an effort where they're like, okay, come on, let's organize. And ever since that percentage came out, Black women were like, wait a minute, 54% of you voted for this man who said he grabs women, inappropriately, let's just say, and he's done all these things and he's sexually assaulted all these people, and he appointed someone to the Supreme Court that sexually assaulted, and you still voted for him.
Yes.
Okay, well, you know what? If you look at the crowd that is out there petitioning, usually there's a big Black female contingency there. And that I have not seen that. There are not that many Black women that are out there. So I don't really know. I can't speak to what's coming, but if they are willing to force a child who could have been impregnated by her uncle or her own father, if they're willing to force that child to carry that baby, God help us. I have no idea what to tell you. I don't know.
Where you say you're from?
I'm from Rising, Arkansas.
Okay, go back to Rising. I guarantee you can find at least 2 white families, what you just described, it happened to.
I could probably go around the corner and find that.
Okay.
There's little to no.
That's their norm, more than we appreciate.
I don't know about that, but I do know that little Black girls are, I think the statistic was 6 to 10 times more likely to be molested than any other girls. We right now have or it should be at this point, 80,000 Black women and girls who are missing, just gone. And right now, if I were to go on and look on television for something on demand, how many JonBenet Ramsey stories am I going to see? How many? And that happened decades ago. And I don't mean to belittle or to dismiss what happened to these families. It's a horrible tragedy. But our children are coming up missing. Our women and girls are coming up missing. 80,000. And this is not even news. I say this to people and they're like, what? Really? And they go Google it and lo and behold, it's there. Because it's very easy to get away with taking somebody that is systematically excluded from every single equation, every societal equation. And we see it, I'm sure you guys see it in medicine. We will certainly see it in law. Breonna Taylor, her killers got convicted because they missed. 2 bullets went into the next apartment. They got convicted because all of their ammo did not land in a woman that was sleeping in her own bed. So if you ask me what next, what to do, I think that baby steps definitely need to be taken within our own communities and within the ways that we are approaching elections. One man said he's starting to feel like he is being a bad parent by staying in America. And he was a Black man. He had 2 daughters. He was just like, I'm starting to feel like I'm being a bad parent by just staying here. But on the grand scale, with Roe v. Wade, I think that the number of that we've created a whole new thing to worry about with our minor girls.
So, Attorney Rochelle, I'm going to give you the same offer that I'm giving to Dr. V. You must come back. This has been fabulous, a fabulous discussion.
Yes.
And we got so much that we have to unpack. So, Dr. Neighbor-Stevens, I wish we could go back to our 2-hour format for this. We got 2 wonderful speakers. Go ahead, have your say. And I know we're way over our time limit.
No, I wasn't trying to say, I was just saying, no, we're not going back to 2 hours, but we have not heard from Dr. Walks.
Okay, so here's what I have. I was raised in a house where we were taught to let people say their own no's. And so I really do want Attorney Rochelle to come back, and I want Dr. B to come back, because these are very complicated and intertwined issues. So here's my concern. We allow people to do things that don't make any sense to us. We allow people to say that restricting abortion is about letting a child come to term, full term, or not. It's not that. It's about what we as society do and how we value the people in our society. So every time someone comes to me and says, well, Dr. Walks, you're a man of faith, and clearly in the Bible, we should all be anti-abortion. I'm like, you know what? Miss me with that, because it's not that simple. And we allow people to write reports, write decisions, and not care what happens to the kids. It is unforgivable that we as a society will allow people to say every child that's conceived has to be born, but yet we don't care about. I spent 5 years on the State Board of Education. It's tough to sit on a Board of Education for a state and not talk about resources that kids have. So I can go on and on. This whole thing frustrates me because it is not simple. And we shouldn't allow people to make it simple. And we definitely have to vote. And And I want us to all do our homework before Attorney Alicia Rochelle comes back. Everybody go read about the Ledbetter case and find out about why. And Congress can make some changes. They can work in the margins. It is not that we have to wait to get a majority of the Supreme Court to do anything about Roe. There's a lot of other things we can do. In particular, we can move people. We can get the next time Amazon is trying to put a big headquarters someplace, have Amazon put their headquarters in North Dakota and bring about 70,000 Democrats to North Dakota. There are a lot of things that we can think about. That may be a ridiculous one. I don't know what I just said. It may be, but I think that when we allow things to be simple, we take the easy way out and our society is not better. I'm hoping we can do the 3-part with Dr. V. I'm hoping we get at least one more part with Attorney Rochelle, because someone that I know is running for Attorney General of the state of Maryland. And if we think that it's okay to be a doctor and not care who the Attorney General is for your state and not care who the elected officials are for your state, that's a problem. So that's what I have.
If I may, a lot of this is born in us not having, as a community, having the ability to stay on code with with a lot of things. Right now, I'm seated in a space that it's called the Gathering Spot. And it was born out of an idea of 2 African-American law students here who were a bit troubled by the fact that Black people couldn't just go and sit and gather at a Starbucks without being harassed by the police. So it's a space, it's got meeting rooms, it's got a restaurant, a bar and everything. And it's annual monthly membership, you pay your fee and everything. They had the first one, it was in Atlanta. This one's here in DC. They're opening one in LA soon. A lot of major cities are getting it. And it is nice to have at least a place where you can meet and talk about these sorts of things, because people in our community, there were people in our community who voted for Trump because they don't believe that a woman needs to be the head of a man. They don't believe that women need to lead anything. They don't believe, they voted for Trump because he was anti-abortion. And they don't believe that anybody should. So there's a lot for us to unpack as a community. There are many things. Yeah, he may be anti-abortion, but if you don't want an abortion, don't have one. Like, it's not telling you that you have to have, we're not on code with a whole lot of things. There are a lot of things that we are fragmented on. And because of that, we cannot vote in our own interests if we're not clear on what our interests are. You can't participate in the patriarchy unless you were the one, or you look like the ones who created it in the first place. It doesn't matter how many promotions you get. There was a Black man that was trying to buy a network. He found that out. There are so many times when we are told that no matter how high you climb, you're not fully American. You're only going to go as high as we want you to. And that in and of itself is an area of concern. And I know 2 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours would not be enough to get this all hashed out. But when our girls go missing and nobody, we're had this hashtag bring back our girls, when that African militia stole those girls from those villages. Mm-hmm. But we have people who haven't seen this little Black girl for weeks and they've done nothing. nothing's done. No one said anything. I mean, the mothers obviously are organizing with their girls, but our men aren't aware of this and aren't organizing and looking. They are missing, like in thin air, on the way to school one day and next gone. So there has to be some sort of, there's so many things. And packing up, moving to North Dakota, I know during the pandemic, if you go online, there are a lot of people who, in light of what happened with George Floyd, packed up and moved to Mexico. I have a friend whose sister did that. And I have another friend who was teaching out of the country, and she's been there ever since her son was 3 because she's terrified of what may happen to him. So she's been raising him over in Abu Dhabi for 5 years, raising a little Black boy in a country where crime doesn't even exist.
That's because they'll cut your hands off if you steal something.
Yeah, so there's no crime.
So we're almost out of time. I just wanted to clarify. I wasn't talking about this notion of moving to North Dakota because we're afraid to stay here. I was talking about changing the Senate. So I don't.
Right.
I want to make sure that was clear. Okay. So,
but we are at our time. I want to give our 2 speakers 2 minutes apiece just to say closing comments before we do that. Dr. V, and you have been wonderful. I'd like to have a final statement from you if you're still here and can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well, this was a very good discussion. It really is. I suppose maybe in the future I will come back and do a lecture on racism, because I don't think we truly understand what that really is and how it functions. And so I have identified at least 11 areas of human activity where racism has a great impact. And unfortunately for African Americans in this country, being victims of racism, the inability to resolve their problems are likely due to the fact that they have failed to understand that they are victims of racism, and there are specific things that victims of racism must do in order to eliminate the legacy of being victimized by racism. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Now to go back to my point, as far as violence is concerned, my only closing statement to that is we need to rethink individuals who commit crimes of violence as it only being psychological in nature. We have to understand that behavior is a function of biology, and there are environmental factors that can exacerbate or ameliorate that situation. And that being said, thank you so much for allowing me to present, Dr. Maxey. I truly appreciate this great honor, and I'm looking forward to coming back to do part 2. I can do, for an example, we can just say this was part 1 of the Neuropsychology of Violence. We can come back and do a part 2 if you like.
We absolutely insist and come back. And this has been so great. And I appreciate my big sister for introducing me to you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Attorney Rochelle, who's recommended by my attorney, Linda Scott, and we just met, and you have absolutely been a star. Would you care to have some final thoughts?
Yes, thank you again. I was kind of thrown when Melinda texted me and she was like, hey, can you do this? She had to take her child to camp, and this is a happy accident or happy occurrence that I was able to meet with you guys. I am by no stretch a constitutional, I'm not Barack Obama on the Constitution, let's just say it like that. But with the recent decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court, we can pretty much expect more of the same. It is tragic, the road that I think that we're going to go down. I fully expect it to be just as brazen and unabashed as Trump was when he was in office, because he's smoked out a whole lot of the people that we in the back of our minds have known have been there, but now they're bold and walking around in daylight for all the world to see. And so we can expect more of the same. So I would strongly urge everyone to become more aware of what the Constitution says. It is very convoluted, and some things are, it's fascinating. But I really do want to thank you guys for having me here, and encourage you to read about it, tell your children about it, tell your people about it. It really is not about religion. It's so much bigger than that. They abolished slavery, but at the same time, that's exactly what's happening in our prison systems when they privatize the prison systems, where corporations that pick all of our vegetables and all that are done by prisoners for free labor. So we could be on this all day.
And I understand there are more Black men in prisons than there were in slavery at this point.
So and there is a constitutional amendment that allows them, because they are prisoners and not necessarily fully recognized citizens. So there's no requirement that they get paid minimum wage or anything for that matter.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So
thank you so much. There are just two people I want to recognize if they're on for a brief comment. The NMA attorney is Singleton McAllister on. And if not, my attorney from Zimbabwe, Brenda Kahari. Okay. Having said that, Dr. Walks and Dr. Napier-Stevens, some final thoughts before we go?
Well, my final thought is come on back next week. We have so much more work to do, and we're in for the long haul, for a long fight. This is not going to be a little skirmish. This is a major war, and we are going to have to be consistent in the fight.
And don't forget, Trump appointed several, I want to say it was hundreds of judges, district judges as well. So the abolition of Miranda rights, or the shredding of Miranda rights, is just the beginning.
So Dr. Maxey, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep my final comments brief.
Impossible.
Good show. Thank you, everyone.
Well, and I think, well, thank everybody for joining with us. And this has been both depressing and uplifting at the same time.
Wow.
We have a lot to do. Thank you both so much. Thank everybody for being here. We'll be back again next week and every week. It's a Sunday. It's a
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great Sunday. Thank you, Simon.
Bye.